video, I will talk to you about Dickey and Rattan's, or DNR's, response to Heck's problem of content. To begin, we have to review some ideas about dynamic sense, which we already saw in the work of Evans and Campbell. So, to recall, in Heck's argument against the Fregean view of communication, Heck appeals to something he calls the usual Fregean criterion. And this is the usual Fregean criterion for the sameness or difference of sense in terms of cognitive value. And the idea is that if you can doubt whether one object is the same under two ways of thinking about it, then those ways of thinking about it are different senses. Okay, so he says, for instance, that two people can communicate about a bottle on a table between them. Despite that, someone seeing the bottle from the one side could doubt whether it's the same bottle when the person is seeing it from the other side. And so Heck applies what he calls this Fregean criterion for difference of sense to establish that the two ways of thinking of the bottle on either side of the table correspond to different senses. So, to be a bit more explicit about what this criterion is, which Heck is appealing to, we can, and this is what DNR called the standard individuation principle. So, going back to the very first lecture when we were introducing Frege's notion of meaning, and as has been elaborated a lot throughout this class, one crucial role that meaning has for Frege is that it explains the cognitive value of its expression. So what is cognitive value? Well, in general, you can think about cognitive value as the way in which we can deploy a singular term or expression within our reasoning. So it has to do with how we rationally use a term. So the idea that sense explains cognitive value is the idea that it is on the basis of our understanding of the meaning of words that we rationally use them in our reasoning. So sense or meaning, according to Frege, plays or explains a cognitive role that language has for us, or the cognitive value of language. It kind of binds together, the sense of an expression kind of binds together how it is we deploy it in our reasoning. Okay, so if it is the case that sense explains cognitive value, then it has to be that the following principle holds, and this is the standard individuation principle. And this is Frege's basic idea for showing how it is that sense can explain cognitive value. It goes as follows. Singular terms A and B differ in sense just in case a subject who understands both expressions could, at a single time, both assent to a sentence of the form A is F, but withhold assent or reject a sentence of the form B is F, and do so without loss of rational coherence. So let me just repeat one of the simple examples of Frege's puzzle. So because the names Hesperus and the names Phosphorus, because those names differ in sense, so Hesperus and Phosphorus, because they differ in sense, someone is able to rationally, or without loss of rational coherence, someone can believe that Hesperus is 5 million years old, but not have to believe, so they could reject that Phosphorus is 5 million years old, okay? Or again, the two names Cicero and Tully, stand for the same ancient Roman statesman. However, it's possible for someone to rationally not realize that Cicero and Tully are the same person. So it's possible for someone to rationally believe that Cicero was a great orator, but not believe that Tully was a great orator. So, and the explanation for that is that these two names, Cicero and Tully, differ in sense. So the idea is this individuation principle illustrates to us how it is that sense plays a role in our rational lives, because it shows how sense dictates when we can rationally take two beliefs to be about different objects or not. Okay, so we can think about difference, sameness, or difference of sense as a kind of rational glue within our mental lives. And because sameness and difference of sense lines up with when we can rationally assent to one sentence and reject another one, or whether we cannot rationally do so, that is how sense is supposed to play or explain the cognitive value of expressions. But when we start thinking about communication and applying Frege's notion of sense to things beyond his examples, what DNR say is that we have to revise this principle. And this insight actually is in Evans's paper, which his response to Perry. But in any case, what we should note about this standard or basic Fregean principle is that this principle cannot be applied to either of the following two types of cases. So it can't be applied to case A, where a single subject is thinking at different times, or cases of type B, where two different subjects are thinking at the same time. Okay, so if we have cases where we have a single subject over time or two different subjects, this principle won't tell us anything about whether or not the singular terms which are in use, so for instance, whether or not the singular terms which a subject is using over time, or whether or not the singular terms which two different people are using, this principle won't tell us whether or not those singular terms have the same or different sense. And that is because this principle, on the right-hand side of the biconditional, it says a subject who understood both expressions could, at a single time, both assent to A as F and withhold assent or reject B as F without loss of rational coherence. But then if we're considering a subject at different times, this right-hand side simply doesn't apply in any way. It's neither true nor false. So if we're considering a subject thinking A as F at one time and then thinking B as F at a different time, okay, we cannot actually apply this to infer whether or not the expressions differ or share a sense, because this right-hand side only applies to a single subject at a single time. And so just because we can't therefore apply it to a single subject over time, we also can apply this to thinking about different subjects. So for instance, one person saying A is F and the other person saying B is F, okay? And then wonder whether they can deny them or not in order to draw conclusions about sameness or difference of sense. We cannot do that because this standard principle is simply giving the conditions for the sameness or difference of sense in terms of for a single subject at a single time. So DNR propose that in order to adequately understand what's happening in communication and adequately draw conclusions about what's involved in communication, we have to extend this standard Fregean individuation principle. Now, the way they suggest doing so is with Campbell's notion of trading on identity. Okay, so if you recall the first lecture on Campbell, we talked about his way of unpacking the notion of cognitive value, and that was in terms of which types of inferences are licensed or not. Okay, so this way of thinking about cognitive value is taken on board by D&R in order to extend the application of the standard individuation principle to cases where there's communication. Okay, so let's first review what this is and then how it can be applied to the case of a single subject at different times. And then we'll see how D&R proposed that this principle can be extended in an analogous way to different subjects at the same time. Is that sameness of sense lets us validly trade on identity, or as D&R say, sameness of sense lets us immediately extend our knowledge. So, to review, consider the contrast between the following two inferences. Now suppose that A and B are two singular terms which stand for the same object. Now, we can wonder whether we're able to infer immediately from saying A is F and B is G that one thing is both F and G. Okay. Or whether we have to add an identity premise which says, so instead of just immediately saying from A is F and B is G that something is both F and G, whether we have to add to this argument an explicit premise stating that A is B. Okay. So this argument form in beta, where we add an explicit identity premise, coordinating the singular terms, there's a sense in which this is always valid. But Campbell says there are certain cases in which this type of argumentation is valid. So he says there are certain cases in which you can validly group together two pieces of information about the same object without having to explicitly establish the identity of those two objects. Okay, so I'll review a case of this in a moment and how it is that this is supposed to be possible. But in general, the idea is that there are certain cases in which we're able to trade on the identity of two singular terms, so you don't have to explicitly establish their identity, but rather we can trade on their identity in virtue of sameness of sense. And when A and B have the same sense, then we can trade on their identity and infer that there is one thing that's both F and G. We can validly infer that without having to add an additional identity premise. Okay, so again, I'll give an example of that in a moment. But the upshot of this is that if we take on board this idea of trading on identity as making sense of cognitive value, which is what sense is supposed to explain, then we can provide a revised individuation principle. And this revised individuation principle, which appeals to trading on identity, we'll see that we're able to apply it to cases where we have a single subject over time or two different subjects. So the revised principle is that A and B differ in sense just in case a subject cannot immediately extend their knowledge using A and B, i.e., the subject cannot validly make the inference alpha. So according to this revised individuation principle, two singular terms A and B differ in sense just in case an inference of this form is not valid. Okay, so if A and B differ in sense, then you cannot validly infer just from A is F and B is G that something is both F and G. you have to, if A and B differ in sense, you have to add this explicit identity premise. Okay? But because we say that A and B differ in sense just in case the subject cannot immediately extend their knowledge in this way, the flip side of this is that A and B have the same sense just in case the subject can immediately extend their knowledge in this way. So A and B have the same sense just in case this inference is valid. Okay? And what D and R say is that we can apply this principle to cases where we have a single subject over time or two different subjects. And we can see that there are cases in which a single subject over time is able to immediately extend their knowledge. And they will say there's cases in which two subjects can also immediately extend their knowledge. And therefore, according to this principle, we can conclude that the singular terms share a sense. Okay, so let's first look at how this is supposed to work for a single subject over time. And we can see this by reviewing Evans and Campbell's discussions of perceptual demonstratives. So the main takeaway from their discussions of perceptual demonstratives is that an individual who has kept track of an object over time by attending to it is able to trade on identity. So there are some cases of type A, we said, so cases in which we have a single subject at different times. There are some cases in which there is sameness of sense. So because there's some cases in which we can have immediate extension of knowledge, we can infer, according to the revised individuation principle, that in those cases there's sameness of sense. Okay, so let me just review one of these cases which I gave in the lecture on Campbell. So I want you to imagine this person, Elijah, who is in a cave, and there's a fly buzzing around the cave above him, bothering him. So in the one version of this case, Elijah is attending to the fly as it roams around the cave. So you can imagine this person is keeping track, visually keeping track of this fly as it moves around. Okay? So the idea is that when someone is visually keeping track of an object as it moves around in time, over time, they are able to immediately collect together different information about that object, which they can express with different singular terms at different times. So, for instance, at one point in the episode of tracking, Elijah might form the belief he would express with the sentence, "That fly is black," so he notices the fly's color. And then at a later point in the episode, Elijah forms a belief he would express with the sentence, "That fly is large." And so the idea is that because Elijah is focusing his attention on this fly over the time in which he forms these two beliefs, he's able to immediately infer that it is one and the same thing that he's thinking of. So so the inference alpha for him in here is valid. So he can say that fly is black, that fly is large, therefore something is both black and large. Okay, so this kind of summarizes the idea that for Elijah, the singular terms that fly expressed at different times are directly coordinated. And so according to the revised individuation principle, that there's difference in sense just in case the subject cannot immediately extend their knowledge. According to that, because Elijah can immediately extend his knowledge, his two demonstratives, that fly, said at one time and then that fly said at a later time, share a sense. So here's how we are applying this revised individuation principle, which uses Campbell's notion of trading on identity as a refinement of cognitive value to decide whether singular terms used at different times by a subject have the same sense or not. And now here in another version of this case, we see that here's a case in which the demonstratives used by Elijah do not share a sense. So imagine just simply that Elijah is not keeping track of the fly. So he sees a fly in front of him, and he quickly notices its color and thinks that fly is black, and then he stops looking at the fly. And then a bit later on, he sees the fly again, but he just doesn't realize whether or not it's the same fly. It's not obvious whatsoever. And at the second time he forms the belief, he would express with the sentence, "That fly is large." Now, because it's not valid in this case for Elijah to think, oh, that fly is black, that fly is large, therefore there's one thing that's both black and large. In this case, Elijah actually has to explicitly establish the identity of the two flies. He has to realize, oh, that fly is the same as that other fly. He has to realize consciously or explicitly that it's the same fly he's seen at both times in order to think that these two properties are of the same object. So intuitively, in this case, Elijah cannot immediately extend his knowledge. And therefore, according to the revised individuation principle, his two uses of the singular terms differ in sense. So now I have done some review about how we can employ the ideas of dynamic sense, attention, and trading on identity to give a kind of revised way of understanding the relationship between sense and cognitive value. Now we will see that Dickey and Rattan's main way of responding to Heck is by extending this view of a single subject at different times by extending it analogously to treating the case of two different subjects at the same time.